I'm Aubrey Hruby, and I am a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by Wamkele Mene, the first Secretary General of the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Africa. He was appointed just last year, and he comes with a long background in trade negotiations, having been the lead trade negotiator for South Africa in the Continental trade negotiations and a representative to the WTO from South Africa. So welcome, Wamkele, to this interview. We'd love to hear how the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is progressing during this COVID period. We know that there has been a stop on global trade and African countries have not been immune, and that you've decided to delay the implementation of the free trade agreement for 6 months as people are unable to travel. Can you give us background on why that decision was made and what you're doing in the meantime to really promote the free movement of goods, capital, and people in the region?
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Aubrey, and thank you for arranging this session. I'm looking forward to this exchange of views. As you said, I was elected by the Assembly of Heads of States in February this year, and I was hoping that by now we would be well on the way to establishing the Secretariat and also implementing the agreement or some aspects of the agreement that have been concluded. But COVID-19 had different plans for us. And so what we have been doing is working very closely within the African Union family, with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to identify products that are essential for fighting the pandemic, so that these products are allowed to transit through the borders, even though the borders are closed. As you know, 42 countries in Africa are either in a full lockdown or a partial lockdown with border closures. And so this transit of essential goods is very, very important. The second thing that we have been doing is to, from a trade perspective, to look at tools that we can use to fight the pandemic that can make access to what is required much more easily available to Africans all over the continent. For example, we have proposed a moratorium on duties on products such as soaps and other germ-killing products that, again, people need to have access to. And so if you remove the duties, you make these products more affordable. And so in the last 2 months, we have been working very hard to find immediate solutions from a trade point of view, to make these proposals to the heads of states so that they are able to, we have a comprehensive and coordinated approach to fighting the pandemic. There are some parts of the African Union that are focusing on the need for debt relief, and we are focusing on the trade aspect as we fight the pandemic. The date of starting to trade under the AfCFTA preferences was set for the 1st of July this year. And of course, it would have been a milestone, but as I said earlier, 42 countries in Africa are either in full or partial lockdown because countries correctly and sensibly are focusing on fighting the pandemic. And so we made a recommendation to the heads of states for them to consider a postponement to the trading date, so that when the conditions are conducive, we resume our work, we re-energize the negotiations where there is still some work to be done, and we redouble our efforts to make sure that trade is back on track at the time when the heads of states will determine is appropriate. And I'm sure they will take into account advice from public health experts about when that would be.
But for our viewers, when you say they're continuing the negotiations, some people may believe that the negotiations are finished because it was signed and it went into force. What areas are still under negotiation and what areas still need a lot of work? We know that implementing a free trade agreement is a decade-long experience. And so what is really on the table right now?
So at the moment, we were very, very close to concluding the rules, what we call the rules of origin negotiations, and
Which
the
means
tariff.
what's a Kenyan good versus a Nigerian good, etc.
Yes, which means if you are not able to determine the origin of the product, then you are not able to give it a preference. So you need to come up with a formula for determining the origin of the product or the value addition in the product. Then it qualifies as an AfCFTA product rather than a product that comes from the US, for example. And really, rules of origin are very, very important for, from our point of view, for the purpose of industrial development, because we want.
And they're not a simple matter for our viewers, because with global supply chains and inputs from different areas, it gets complicated to figure out where a good is born and transformed.
Absolutely, it is a very, very complicated negotiation. But as I say, it's very important for industrial development, because if you get a shirt from a third country, you put a button on it, you cannot say it is made in Africa or it is made in Ethiopia. There's no value addition in putting a button on a shirt. So what we want to do, and this is why this rules of origin negotiation is so important, we want to place Africa on a path to industrial development. And we want industrial development to contribute to the manufacturing of value-added products in Africa. For example, in this crisis, we want Africa in a few years' time to be able to produce ventilators and manufacture them here in Africa. So rules of origin are a very important part of Africa's industrial development strategy over the long-term period of time. So that's where we are. We were very close to concluding rules of origin. We were very close to concluding on the tariff negotiations, which would have enabled us to start trading on the 1st of July, as was determined. That timeline had obviously, because of COVID-19, that timeline could not be met. The month of March and April and May, these months were critical in the final stages of the negotiations. And so that is where we are. We still have some technical work to conclude, but I believe that when things are back on track, we will move swiftly to conclude the remaining part of the negotiations so that we start implementing phase 1 of the agreement. There is phase 2.
Is this crisis really an opportunity to innovate around how trade negotiations are done? I mean, we all know that Africa is fragmented. There's 54 countries, getting together. There's many, many languages. Getting together to do trade negotiations. And for those of us like me and you who've been to Geneva and have sat in the room with the negotiations, it's very laborious and it's very dependent on working groups meeting in person. Are you looking for ways to innovate around how trade negotiations are done digitally? Can you do some of this virtually?
Well, I think we actually, as a matter of fact, started that discussion. But you have to overcome a number of things. Some of them you've mentioned. There are questions around confidentiality. Of course, anybody in a room can leak negotiating information. It happens, but there are very big questions around confidentiality. We have 4 official languages, and so our meetings are always, there has to be simultaneous interpretation into the 4 languages. There has to be translation of the documents into the 4 languages. These are text-based negotiations, and so you are negotiating on the screen that is projected in front of you, and this happens all the way even to the level of heads of states sometimes. There are 4 or 5 different time zones in Africa, so that also has to be taken into account. And then, of course, the most important part is whether the rules of negotiations allow this to happen. Because remember, in the African Union, there are rules for meetings, normal, ordinary meetings, and then there are specialized rules for negotiations. So there are legal questions also that arise, which we're in the process of exploring. What I will note is this: the WTO at the beginning of the crisis of the pandemic decided that there should be no negotiations of substantive issues that are to be done virtually. I was not there, obviously, when that decision was taken, but I suspect that that decision was taken as a result of all of these technical feasibility questions that I've just mentioned.
So maybe it's an area where Africa can innovate beyond what the WTO is doing. Another area where I think COVID is kind of fast forwarding innovation and development is in the need to digitize customs and other logistics. We
Yes.
know, again, the cost of trade in Africa is very high because of the landlocked nature of so many African countries, and
Yes.
again, how many borders goods cross. So, you know, how are we working to really work on the trade facilitation front in terms of digitization of customs and other logistical processes?
Well, this is a very, very important part of my work. When I was campaigning in the campaign mode for this position, it was one of the one of the main pillars of my campaign platform. And that is because when you look at digital trade, e-commerce, and you look at the drivers, at least in Africa, you look at the drivers of e-commerce, you look at the drivers of innovation for e-enabled trade, it is young Africans in trade. Whether you are in Kigali or in Lagos, young Africans are really at the cutting edge of innovation for digital trade and e-commerce enabled platforms. So our job really will now be to establish the regulatory framework, the laws that facilitate that enable that. And second, you mentioned customs procedures. I want us to establish a platform that will be for all AfCFTA state parties that they can switch onto for more efficient customs procedures. For example, without being too technical, we have what we call certificates of rules of origin. If you produce this product and it is fully obtained in a particular country, you get a certificate and you can export it to another country in Africa. At the moment, that process is manually done. So what I intend for us to do as a secretariat is to fully digitize our trade so that even things such as certificates of origin can be done digitally for more efficient and more affordable trade. The second thing that we are at advanced stages of establishing is a payments platform. We're working very, very closely with AfCFTA Bank to establish a payments and settlement platform that will support trade finance, that will support the implementation of the AfCFTA, so that when you have more efficient payments procedures, not just for this agreement, but in future, so that we have a payments platform that is affordable, that is efficient, and that really is less reliant on systems from elsewhere in the world. So we want to build self-sufficiency in our payments systems and settlement systems. So I'm very excited about the digital trade program that we're going to establish.
Yeah, and for those of you watching this interview, you should also watch our discussion with President Aramo of the AfCFTA Bank, because he at length spoke about this exact issue about the settlement, and you need to have trade bonds that you can travel across borders with, and basically looking at innovations around blockchain to use these things to verify. And really, I think reducing the costs, the times at customs, at ports, at going across borders is going to make that's going to realize the actual benefit in terms of job creation and economic growth from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. because as we know from the trade facilitation work at the WTO, Africa has, I mean, the upside is billions and billions of dollars if we can deal with some of these inefficiencies.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned about being self-sufficient in some of these areas. And it is definitely true that COVID is pushing African countries to really embrace local opportunities because of the shutdown of global trade. How do you see supply chains reshaping after COVID? There's been conversation in the US and in Japan about moving their supply chains, their manufacturing out of China. In some ways, that's an opportunity for African countries, particularly say Ethiopia, to attract some of that manufacturing. But at the same time, African countries also need to really look at ways to ensure food security and reduce the import bill for food. So how do you see supply chains reshaping? Will we see a reshoring to African countries?
Well, this is a great question. This crisis has exposed Africa's weakness from an industrial development point of view, and also from the point of view of being overly reliant on global supply chains. And we see when there is a disturbance in global supply chains, when you are over-reliant, for example, the commodities prices. When the commodities, global commodities markets get subdued, many African countries that are over-reliant on that supply chain, they suffer, as we see happening now. So our response to that has got to be, how do we establish regional value chains for productive capacity in Africa? How do we establish manufacturing centers of excellence across the African continent, covering a range of different areas? I mentioned, for example, the personal protection equipment, value-added production. Even in the area of automobiles, Africa has an excellent opportunity to encourage, by establishing regional value chains on automobiles, to encourage global manufacturers of automobiles to manufacture their components in Africa.
Sure, and Morocco and South Africa have done a lot in that area. I've been to the Ford facility in South Africa, and I know Morocco does a lot of that because of its trade agreements as well with the US.
Absolutely. So if we are able to do that in a Pan-African sense, and we roll out value chains across the African continent, I think we will be moving towards self-sufficiency from a supply chain point of view, from an industrial development point of view, and of course, the ultimate objective is to create jobs. So we have this massive opportunity to significantly reconfigure our supply routes and reconfigure our value chains in the region, not to disconnect from the global economy, but simply for the purpose of being more self-sufficient from an industrial development point of view, and to be less reliant on these value chains that create significant disturbance to your goods, to access to your goods, if you are solely reliant on them. There are countries today, African countries that are landlocked, that are struggling to get access to these essential goods that are essential for fighting the pandemic. And so this is a type of an over-reliance that we want to reduce without being disconnected from the global community.
And it's in part about capturing a larger share of the value chain. For example, let's think about the future of self-driving cars and that they need lithium batteries. We know that those minerals come from African countries, even graphite, manganese, but today they're refined in China. If you look at the Chinese percentage of how much refined graphite and refined manganese they're doing, so it's still that classic, you know, hundreds of years of Africa exporting the raw material, and then the value addition being done in this case in Asia. And in those value chains, because you can't move where the lithium is, it's in, you know, DRC, it's in many countries. So, you know, being able to be a larger part of that same value chain will change the realities of, for example, government coffers that are able to do more Forex from those kind of exports, but also hopefully create some jobs in the refining process.
Absolutely, and this is in the conversations that I've been having in the last month with multinational corporation, global corporations. This is exactly the point that they are making. If we as Africans can establish the legal framework, which is what this agreement does, the legal framework for trade and investment, intra-Africa trade and investment. This is a market of 1.2 billion people, a combined GDP of $2.5 trillion. By 2030, the combined consumer and business GDP, the aggregate, will be $6.7 billion. So we are at $6.7 trillion, I'm sorry. So we're looking at a substantial market. What we have to do is to establish the legal framework, and then we work with the investors to invest in Africa, to conduct this beneficiation of minerals in Africa, and to do value addition and manufacturing in Africa. You can't do that if you don't have the legal framework. If you don't have trade and investment rules that will be applicable up and down the African continent, you will continue to have a fragmentation in the market. And this is something that investors do not want to see. Whether you are an African investor or whether you are a foreign investor, market fragmentation, different sets of regulations for different countries, this is what deters investment. And so I'm very confident that as we develop a single rulebook for trade and investment, we are laying the foundation for enhanced investment into Africa.
And you're really laying the future of trade for the whole world, because as we've lived in this era of US-Chinese trade tensions and reduction of trade, African countries have been the stalwart supporters of free trade, creating the largest free trade area in formation since the founding of the WTO. And, you know, since you and I met in Washington, I've been inspired because you're that next generation of leaders coming in at a Pan-African level. And so I just want to end to our viewers by asking you, what's inspiring you right now, given all the challenging times we live in? You know, what innovations are you seeing as we look forward that give you hope?
Yeah. Well, the innovations that are giving me a great sense of hope, and in e-commerce, in digital trade. We, as a result of this crisis, we have seen new innovations such as digital pharmacies, such as remote visit with your doctor, your physician. And what I would like us to do as Africans is to take these innovations and codify them into the agreement by laying the basis, the regulatory framework for e-commerce, so that young Africans who are innovators, who generate all of these software, these platforms that enable trade, so that they become part of implementation of this agreement. I think that's a very exciting prospect, is how do you get young Africans who are innovators, who are actually the drivers of digital enabled trade, how do you get them to be on board as we implement the agreement? That's a very encouraging prospect for me. Second, I think what we as Africans and many African countries, we don't have the fiscal policy space, the monetary policy space to provide these trillions and trillions of dollars in economic recovery packages. So for us as Africans, the only stimulus package that we have, the only economic recovery tool that we have collectively as Africans, is implementation of this agreement, so that trade becomes the driver of Africa's recovery from 2021 onwards, and so that we boost intra-Africa trade significantly to ensure that we are on a recovery path. So these two things out of this crisis, I see as very, very important encouraging factors.
Well, thank you, Wamkele. You as Secretary General, we all have great confidence in, and we're so glad you took time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And we look forward to future conversations and being supportive in any way we can. You have many friends in Washington and beyond. So thank you again, Secretary General, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. Thank you.